Hi, welcome to NDE TV. I'm Peggy Robinson. Today's guest is Dr. Yvonne Kason, and she's going to tell us about her 5 near-death experiences. Hi, Yvonne.
Hi, Peggy. Thanks for having me. It's wonderful to be here. And I'm here especially today because I'm so excited about my new book that just came out, which is about my 5 near-death experiences, where I share the stories in a lot of detail. So I just right at the start, I want to let everybody know about my new book, Soul Lessons from the Light. And you can get it from your favorite bookstore. But everything I'm going to be talking about today is in that book. And it's a miracle that I was able to write it. I'll be sharing that at the end of my story today because I was disabled for 12 years. And it's thank you to a miracle that happened in 2016, a miracle healing that I had that healed my brain, that enabled me to write books and share my story. So this book is more than just the sharing of my story. It's also a testimonial that miracles can happen, because it's a miracle that I was able to write this book after being disabled with a brain injury for 12 years and then healed. So my NDE story is a long one because, as Peggy mentioned, I have had 5 near-death experiences, I now realize. And I now realize that I didn't know until really a few years ago. I didn't put the pieces together that I had 2 near-death experiences when I was a child, in addition to the 3 I had when I was an adult. And the 2 I had as a child, the first one happened when I was 5 years old, and I'll tell you about it. But, as a 5-year-old, you don't have any sense of what's called normal or what's called paranormal, right? So this was just what happened to me. And it never dawned on me to label it as something other than just what happened to me. And similarly, my second childhood near-death experience happened when I was 11. It just, again, never occurred to me that this was different from what everybody else was experiencing. So I didn't realize really till about 5 years ago, oh my goodness, I started having near-death experiences as a child. No wonder I'm so open to near-death experiences. And now I've had 5 over the course of my life. So my first one, I now realize, happened when I was 5 years old. And basically, to make a longer, very interesting story shorter, so that I can squeeze in all 5 of my near-death experiences today, is that I was traveling with my parents in Europe, and we were at a train station, and I was a little, very active and curious 5-year-old. I was looking around the train station, and I saw a station hand jump off the platform we were on, jump down onto the railway tracks, run across, and then climb up on the platform on the other side. And as a little 5-year-old, thinking of climbing in the schoolyard and all that sort of stuff, I thought, oh, that looks like fun. So I leaned forward to jump on the tracks to copy what this fellow had done. And then all of a sudden, it was like time stood still. It was as if my life was a movie, and someone had pressed the pause button, and there I was, poised in midair, and it just froze. The scene froze. But my consciousness didn't freeze. What happened is my consciousness, suddenly I found myself 20 or 25 feet above my body, and I was looking down, watching this frozen screen, like the pause button had been pressed on my life. And what I could see when I was 20 or 25 feet above my body was something that I had not seen when I started jumping forward, but that there was a train rapidly coming into the station, and I was jumping right in front of a rapidly oncoming train. And I remember this very clearly. I now know it was out of body, but back then I didn't, of course, as a child. But I remember so clearly that when I was out of body and I saw this, I remember thinking very, very calmly, like I wasn't frightened or upset at all, which of course is a characteristic of near-death experiences, that you feel that peace and that calm. I looked very peacefully and very calmly, totally unafraid. And I remember thinking, oh, I see. I'm about to be hit by a train. No fear at all. I knew I was about to be killed. And then whoosh, suddenly somebody like released the pause button and the movie of my life started, and a man's hand came from behind on the platform, pulled my little body back onto the platform so that I was not hit by the train. And the train whooshed in front of me, and I felt the wind in my face. My parents, of course, started scolding me for being so naughty. And you know, I was sort of stunned, and I didn't talk about this experience afterwards because I didn't want to bring on a scolding again. But I remember very, very clearly that after this experience, I thought I could fly. And I think I was having out-of-body experiences in my dreams too, because I also have clear memories of flying down the street of my home after this. And I started kindergarten about a month or so after this had happened, and I made a new little friend. And I remember saying to my little friend, you know what, I can fly. And my little friend, no, you can't. No, nobody can fly. And I said, I'll show you. I'll prove it to you. So I remember this so clearly. I climbed up on the fence in front of my house, and I spread out my arms so they'd be like wings, and I jumped off. You know, my little 5-year-old, I jumped off, and I expected to be able to show my friend how I could fly down the street. And of course, I couldn't fly. I tumbled to the ground. And I remember my reaction was I was confused. I couldn't figure it out because I had such a clear memory of what I thought was flying, which I now know was out-of-body experiences. And I couldn't figure out why I couldn't reproduce it for my friend. Anyway, now looking back, I realized that has enough of the diagnostic criteria of Moody that classifies as a near-death experience. So that was my first childhood near-death experience. My second childhood near-death experience happened when I was 11 years old. And I had just turned 11, and puberty was still far away. So I was really a kid. I was just a kid. And my family was in a very, very serious car accident where when we were on the expressway going fast, we were in a station wagon, and the station wagon got a flat tire, and it veered off the road, and then it fell down a very steep embankment and rolled over a few times. And I was 11. I was sitting in the back seat of the car, and I got thrown, it appears, during the accident into the rear luggage compartment of the station wagon, which had been filled with suitcases. And I must have had a head injury because I was then unconscious, buried under the luggage when the car came to a stop. Now, my memories of the worldly events end when the car lurched and went into the embankment. But I have other memories. I was unconscious for 3 days, and I have other memories that happened during those 3 days that my body was unconscious. So the first memory I have is of floating above the accident scene. So above the accident scene, you know, some people had pulled my father out of the wreckage, and he was sitting at the roadside, and he was very seriously injured, big laceration on his scalp, blood was pouring down his face. And he was looking around, and he could see that they'd not found me. I mean, nobody could see me. I was buried under the luggage, and I was just a little kid. And he kept saying, my father, my daughter, my daughter, my daughter. And they had found my sister, and they thought he was referring to my sister, and people didn't bother realizing there's another daughter and to look for me. And but I was watching from above as my father kept saying this. And he told me later, when I talked to him afterwards, years later, that yes, that's exactly what happened. That he was laying there he was there on the pavement, and he was looking to make sure his whole family was rescued. He was counting were all her kids there, and he realized one of his daughters was missing. So he was calling for me, my daughter, my daughter. And I sort of wonder if it's maybe that bond of love, that somehow my soul knew that he was calling out for me, which was why my soul was hovering right above my father and witnessing him calling out for me, my daughter, my daughter. Anyway, interestingly enough, my memory then jumps in time, and I have a very clear memory of when they had brought my body to the emergency department of the local hospital. And I'm like 20 or 30 feet above my body. It was as if the ceiling had become transparent and I could look through the ceiling, and I'm looking down and I can see my little body lying there on what I now know is an examining table like we have in hospital emergency departments. And I saw two men sort of huddled over my body, and I assumed that they were doctors. And the other interesting thing is I could see this big round disc-shaped lamp that was between me and the scene below me. And like, I now know that that is what operating room and emergency room lamps look like. But as an 11-year-old, I had no idea they looked like that. And I was seeing it from a top-down perspective. I was looking at the top of the lamp to see the scene that was happening below me. Anyway, so I watched that scene for a while, and then my memory jumps again in time, and suddenly it's 3 days later, and I clearly remember the moment that I woke up. And I remember opening my eyes. I was in a bed in the children's ward in the hospital with the railings pulled up. There were other beds in the room with children asleep in it. It was at night, and I really had to pee. So I pulled out, I guess I had intravenous or something in my hands. I pulled the stuff out, and then I climbed over the railing trying to find a bathroom. And I didn't know they'd put me in diapers while I was unconscious. And because 11-year-old, you don't use diapers anymore. So I was looking for a washroom. And so I remember sort of going barefoot, paddling down the hall, looking for a washroom, and a nurse comes running out, what? Blah, blah, blah. And so then I was back. But interestingly enough, I mean, I now know that those out-of-body memories also classify this as a near-death experience. But I never knew that. I never thought of it. As for all I knew as an 11-year-old, that's what happened to everybody when they had a head injury and were unconscious. And it just never dawned on me to even think of it as anything out of the ordinary. But something now, as I look back, and I've been researching near-death experiences and other spiritually transformative experiences for 40 years now, that's my medical specialty as a doctor, that I had after effects from this near-death experience that are really classic also for near-death experiences after effects. Because for about a year after that accident, when I had the near-death experience at age 11, I was able to see ghosts. I had mediumistic abilities. But of course, as an 11-year-old child, I didn't understand this, and it scared me. And I remember telling my parents, I thought our house was haunted. That's how I understood it. Our house is haunted. And you know, they probably dismissed it as, you know, stress from the car accident or something like that was making me have an active imagination or who knows what. But I remember I was so frightened by the spirits that I was seeing that I asked my parents to move my bed out of my bedroom, because I was supposed to be in a bedroom by myself at age 11. And I wanted it in the bedroom with my younger brother and sister. So there'd be 3 of us in the same room, and I wouldn't be so scared at night when I was seeing these spirits. And so they complied. So I slept with them for that year in the same room as them. And then interestingly enough, about a year, they lasted for about a year, and then I stopped seeing spirits at night, which to me as a kid was a relief. and now I realize it was an after effect, because we know this is an after effect that a lot of people get, whether they're children or adults, after their near-death experience, is mediumistic.
It's so funny how our experiences are textbook before there was a textbook.
And I didn't know, like I as a child, I didn't even put the two together, you know, that
Right.
they were somehow connected. So anyway, my next near-death experience, or my first adult near-death experience, I have to say that before it happened in 1976, when I was in medical school, when I started meditating, I had a very profound meditation experience, which I now know is a Kundalini awakening with a mystical experience. And I'm just saying this because one of the things that I think is that Kundalini awakening and near-death experiences are connected. And I don't know if my childhood near-death experiences made me more open to the Kundalini awakening in 76, if the Kundalini awakening in 76 made me more open to the near-death experience that I'm about to tell you that happened in 79. I don't know which is the chicken or the egg, but both were happening to me. Both started happening to me in the 70s when I was a young adult. So in 1979, when I was already a young doctor and I was finishing my residency, I was assigned to work in Northern Ontario, Canada, with some of the Native Indian communities in a very remote hospital. And I was assigned on this day, March 27th, 1979, to accompany a critically ill patient on a medevac, a medical evacuation. And it was being done by airplane. So, and it was not being done by a helicopter. It was being done by a small twin propeller airplane called the Piper Aztec. So it's a really tiny little plane. They had taken out the second row and third row seat in order to put the stretcher for with the patient in. And then her feet were at the back of the plane, at the bench seat, the back of the plane. That's how small the plane was. And on the opposite side, behind the empty co-pilot seat, I was seated. The patient was intubated, which meant she had a tube into her airway, and there was this bag called an ambu bag that I had to pump to help her breathe. And we had an oxygen tank. And then there was a nurse in the seat behind me on the third row on the right side, and she was tending to the IVs. So the patient had IVs going in both arms. Anyway, so we took off from a runway in this small little town called Sioux Lookout, and we were going to fly this critically ill patient to the closest major hospital that had intensive care unit facilities to look after her very serious condition. And so as we flew, it should have been about an hour flight, but it was in winter in Canada, and we flew into like a blizzard, bad weather, and the storm was in the wind, was making the plane shake and everything. But I just, I was focusing pretty well on my patient and not really paying attention to the weather. That was the pilot's issue. But then suddenly, like if you've ever ridden in a propeller plane, the engines are really loud, really noisy. So you can hear when the engines are going. And I was not very far. The plane was so small from where the engines were. I was maybe 10 feet from one engine and maybe 12 feet from the other engine. So I could hear the loud roaring of these propeller engines. All of a sudden, when we were maybe halfway on our trip, our destination, in this horrible storm, all of a sudden I heard that the roaring sound of the right engine had stopped, and that the propeller was sputtering to a stop. And I looked out the window and I see the propeller stopping, and I thought, uh-oh, I yell up to the pilot, what's going on? What's going on? And I could see he's pushing levers and buttons and doing things. He's trying to get the engine restarted. And then he does manage to get their engine restarted. So I'm thinking, okay, good. But, my antenna are starting to go up. This is not good to have one engine stop on a twin engine plane. So anyway, I went back to attending to my patient. And of course, the turbulence from the storm was quite bad. And then all of a sudden, I heard a change in the sound of the other motor. This time, the left motor stopped, and the left motor was sputtering to a stop. And so again, I'm shouting up to the pilot, what is going on? And he's, doing all sorts of stuff, wrestling with the plane. And I noticed that he had, in the interim, he had lowered the altitude of the plane. So we weren't near as high as we were before. And the other thing, he was trying to steer us so that we'd be over a frozen lake rather than over the heavily forested area, the trees, hills and trees that were around us. And while I noticed this, then all of a sudden the right engine stopped too. So that meant we had no engines going, and we were crashing down to the ground. And it was like the most horrible air turbulence you can imagine, the plane going down. If you wonder what it's like, that's what it's like. And my immediate reaction, like an instinct, was intense fear and panic. Like I was just overwhelmed with intense fear and panic. And out of my heart just jumped these words. It was like a reflex. Oh God, help, I'm going to die. And I didn't say it out loud. It came out of my heart. It was a thought. And as I look back, I guess for God, for the Lord, that was close enough to a prayer, because that is when my near-death experience started. It actually started before the plane hit the ground. And so we were still going down in this horrible turbulence. And all of a sudden, this feeling of peace started descending upon me. And it was literally like it was pushing down all of the fear. And then I heard this voice in my mind, and I'd never heard voices in my mind before. It was a masculine voice. And it said, "Be still and know that I am God. I am with you now and always." And with those words, this incredible spiritual feeling of safety and peace came over me. And even though we hadn't crashed yet, I had no fear at all. And the patient had regained consciousness. I mean, I was fully alert. I was fully awake. We hadn't crashed yet. The patient had regained consciousness, and she was looking at me with like really, really scared eyes. And I remember because I comforted her, and I knew in my heart that everything would be okay, whether we lived or died. So I was able to really honestly just look her in the eyes and say, "It's all right. Everything's going to be okay." And she was comforted by those words. I'm glad that Spirit gave me that opportunity to comfort her before the crash. Anyway, the pilot really, really heroically was steering the free-falling plane. He had brought up the landing gear so that he was trying to do a belly landing, an emergency belly crash landing on the surface of ice. He'd avoided us crashing into the trees. And actually, he'd miraculously been able to do that. We were skidding along our belly, along the ice, and you'd think we're going to be fine. And we would have been if the ice was thick enough, but it was not. And as soon as the plane came to a stop, the weight rapidly broke the ice, and the plane nosedived and sank into very deep water. So we had to get out of the plane really, really quickly while it was sinking. I managed to get out. I managed to pull the nurse out. We tried with all of our might to pull the patient out, but we could not get her stretcher and her out of the plane. Unfortunately, she went down with the plane when the plane nosedived into very deep water. The pilot got out the other side. And then I found myself in open water, in sub-zero weather, wearing really heavy winter clothes, a heavy winter parka and heavy boots, and they were starting to pull me down like lead weights into the water. And the closest land was about 20 yards away, and it was an island. And between where I was and the island was the water had a fast moving current. And I later found out the place that I crashed is called Devil's Gap. That's his real name. And it's called Devil's Gap because of the strong current. It's hazardous in summer and winter, and the ice doesn't freeze over there in the winter. And I would have to swim the Devil's Gap in order to get to the closest shore, which is like interesting. And the voice in my head said, "Swim to shore." Now, being inexperienced with spiritual experiences at that young age, I argued with the voice. I mentally argued with it. I said, "I'm not going to swim to shore. I took lifeguarding. They tell you in case of a boating accident, don't try to swim to shore. It's farther than you think. You're going to drown." And the pilot was shouting, "Try to get on the ice. Try to get on the ice." So instead of swimming to shore, I turned away and I swam towards the ice, hoping that the ice would be thick enough to support my weight. But it wasn't. It kept on breaking and sinking to the water when I tried to climb on. And the voice repeats, "Swim to shore." And then finally, the third time the voice said, "Swim to shore," I finally surrendered. I mean, hopefully I've learned since that time to listen to higher guidance, but I finally surrendered to that higher wisdom, and I started swimming to shore. And I told the other two, the ice is too thin. We have to swim to shore. Anyway, it was a really long and a really difficult swim. And I as I said, I go in a lot more detail in my books, but I'm going to give you the highlights today. Is that I went under several times in the process of swimming to shore, just out of sheer exhaustion. And then I would, with all my strength and all my might, kick to try and get my mouth above water again and get a gasp of air. And my body temperature was dropping and I was getting more and more exhausted. And so somewhere in the process of swimming to shore is where my near-death experience deepened. That's the word that we use in the field. And it shifted, it changed. And all of a sudden what happened was I heard this loud sort of whooshing or roaring sound, like the whoosh, roaring of wind or the whoosh of a waterfall. And with this noise, suddenly I found my consciousness lift up out of my body, and I was maybe 20 or 30 feet above my body, but I was not dead. My body was still struggling to swim to shore. So it was actually more complicated than that. It was actually my consciousness was two places at the same time. And how I explain it is sort of like a split screen TV where you have a little tiny image in the corner and the main image in the screen. So a little tiny bit of my consciousness, like the little image in the corner, was still in my body that was still desperately struggling to try to swim to shore. But the bulk of my consciousness, which would be like the big image on the screen, at the same time was above and looking down and observing. And then I floated even higher and I went into this space or place or state. It's hard to know what to say. I found myself in a place that was filled with light and filled with love. I mean, it was a dark, stormy day in the world, but where I found myself, it was like the closest I've been able to find is when you're rising up in an airplane and you're right at the very, very top of clouds, right before you're going to break into the bright sunlit sky above, where it's all white and sparkly with sort of diffused white light. That was what the white light was like. But the most powerful aspect for me was not the light, but it was the love I was feeling. I was feeling just profound, powerful, beautiful, perfect, unconditional love. It was the most powerful, beautiful love I had ever felt in my life. And it felt like I was home. It felt like I was where I belonged. I felt totally embraced and permeated by this light. And for an instant, I saw a little face of light in the periphery, and then it sort of shifted and faded into like the cloud-like periphery of the light. Now, I did not hear some voice or anything talk to me or teach me when I was in the light, but I suddenly somehow knew things. I just knew things in my soul while I was in the light. And what I absolutely knew, somehow, I can't say how I knew, but I did. I absolutely knew that this love that I was feeling was the love of the higher power that I had been raised to call God. And what I was experiencing God to be was not at all what I had been taught. It was not an old man with a long white beard sitting on a throne judging me had I been good or bad. That was not what I was experiencing at all. What I was experiencing is God, the higher power, whatever term people want to use, but for me it was God, was this incredibly, infinitely loving force field presence, infinite intelligence that is interpenetrating all of creation, all of past, present, future, even all of non-creation, all of everything. And that I and everybody else, we're all profoundly and deeply loved by this higher power God, this incredibly loving God. And somehow I knew too that all the different religions and the ways that they're trying to understand who we are and God, that we're all like climbing up different angles of the mountain and have a different perspective. But when you get to the top, it's the same one loving higher power there for everybody that loves each and every one of us, no matter what angle we're trying to come to be close with our higher power. And the other thing that I absolutely knew was what I think of as me would live on, whether my body down there, if it died and didn't continue to exist on the worldly plane, that me, would continue to live on in spirit, in the light. And so this experience made me completely lose my fear of death, because I know where I'm going to go after, and there's nothing to fear. So anyway, my body, rather heroically, I'm just going to cut the story a little bit because of time, but heroically, I managed to make it to shore through the grace of God. And there was a whole series of coincidences, if you believe in coincidences or divine coincidences, that led to a dramatic and heroic rescue, where when we crashed, nobody could pick up the Mayday message from the pilot. He radioed out unless they were directly overhead because of the snow and the storm and the big hills around the lake. But guess what? There was a plane directly overhead that picked up the message and was able to radio it down to ground and say exactly where our plane had crashed. And the only vehicle that could possibly have rescued us was a helicopter. And normally there's no helicopters around there because we'd swum to an island. But just that day, because of the storm, a helicopter set down just 5 miles from where we crashed, and they picked up the message of the accident. They came out and they started looking for us. They found us. They took us by helicopter to the closest hospital. And I remember watching from above as they landed the helicopter on the driveway of the hospital, and the emergency staff put out their stretchers and laid me on a stretcher and wheeled me in. And I remember a nurse trying to take my temperature. I was watching from above, and she was puzzled because she couldn't get a temperature reading on her thermometer. And the reason was my body temperature was colder than the bottom reading of her thermometer. I was dying of hypothermia, and I could feel myself getting colder and colder, and my consciousness splitting away from my body. And I was fine because I was mainly in the light, and I was in love, and I was in peace. I was in joy. I had no fear of crossing over. And all of a sudden, out of my physical body came the words, "Boy, could I use a hot bath." And I was surprised because, I hadn't thought of those words, but they came out of my physical body. So I don't know if an angel overshadowed me or whatever and spoke those words, but that was exactly what my body needed. I needed to be reheated and fast in order to survive. And when the nurses heard that, they took us down to the physiotherapy department, put my body in the hot whirlpool bath there, which reheated me, which was what I needed. And then it was there, as I was being reheated, that I felt my consciousness re-enter my body. And what that felt like was like what they depict on TV with a genie being sucked into a bottle. That's what it was like. It felt like I was in this big space up there, and then through the top of my head, this tiny little opening, the top of my head, I was sucked into the tiny confines of my body. And then I knew, I'm back. I remember saying that as I rubbed my hands against my frozen hands against my legs in the hot water. I'm back. I'm going to live. So this was my first adult near-death experience, and it was profoundly impactful on me. I mean, it completely changed my life. As a medical doctor, I really wanted to find a word to describe this experience. And I went to I was off work for a while because of my frostbite, etc. But when I went back to work, I remember talking to my doctor friends and saying, "Have you ever heard of anything like this?" I described what happened to me out of body and the light and feeling the love of God and all that. And all of my doctor friends, I mean, they all knew I was a really first-class doctor, so they didn't think I was crazy, but everybody had a hallucination theory, right? That, oh, you hallucinated because of a low blood sugar. You hallucinated because of an electrolyte imbalance. And I was going, no, that did not resonate with me at all. So I learned very quickly that I couldn't talk to my medical colleagues about what happened. And then there was a person in Toronto who said that they knew a bit about near-death experiences. So I went and talked to this person, and I said, is it possible that what I had was a near-death experience? And so he said to me, well, did you see a tunnel with a light at the end of it? I went, no. He says, were you clinically dead? And I said, no, I think the closest I was unconscious. And they said, well, it was definitely not a near-death experience. I went, okay, it's not a near-death experience. Well, what is it? And I mean, now I know that judgment was incorrect, because now we know that people can have near-death experiences when they're facing death or close to death. You don't have to be clinically dead to have a near-death experience. But we didn't know that back in the 70s. There was very little knowledge about near-death experiences. So I figured, well, it's not a near-death experience, not a hallucination. What is it? And so I kept looking, and I finally found one of my medical colleagues who was a very devout Christian, listened to my story, and he said, you know, Yvonne, I think you've had a mystical experience. So I would say for almost 12 years, I called what happened to me in the plane crash my mystical experience that happened to me in the plane crash. But now I know that it is a near-death experience. So another thing that was happening in the late 70s and early 80s when I was coming to grips with my near-death experience was that people thought that you only ever had one near-death experience, that it was like the one experience and it inspired you for the rest of your life, and that was how it was. So once I'd even figured out that it was a near-death experience, I certainly was not expecting that I would have another, or that I would have two more. But lo and behold, I did.
And you hadn't remembered your two childhood NDEs.
I remembered them, but I'd never labeled them as near-death experiences. Okay. I've always remembered them. I just never had labeled them as a near-death experience until about 5 years ago. So my next adult near-death experience happened in 1995. And again, I'm going to give you the capsulized version of it. For more details, folks, that's why I wrote the book, Soul Lessons from the Light. But what happened in 1995 is I was in a major large Air Canada aircraft, and I was flying from Edmonton to Toronto, and we flew into a winter storm. And I fly a lot. I was determined to overcome my fear of flying after the plane crash, which I did. I forced myself to fly, and because I'm not afraid of dying, you sort of lose your fear of dying in a plane crash. So anyway, I was flying in this plane, and I remember we were flying from Edmonton to Toronto, and I remember thinking on the plane, that it was a plane from Edmonton that flew over my plane crash site. I wonder if we're going to fly over the plane crash site. We flew into a winter storm. I remember thinking, oh, that's interesting. The day of my crash, we flew into a winter storm too. Isn't that an interesting coincidence? Then I looked out my window and I saw that ice was forming on the wings of the plane from the winter storm we had flown into. And I remember thinking, oh, isn't that interesting? They say there was ice forming in some part of the plane in 1979 that ended up causing the plane crash. I think, oh, these are interesting similarities. And then I turned to reading the newspaper that the flight attendant had given me, and I'm looking at the date on the page, and all of a sudden, into my eyes, what I clearly see, clear as can be, March 27th. And like March 27th, 1979 was the date of my plane crash near-death experience. So when I see on the page March 27th, I'm like shocked. I'm going, what? What am I doing flying on March 27th again? Like how could I have not noticed that I booked it? It can't be March 27th. I'm looking at it clear as can be. It says March 27th. And as I'm staring at it in shock, it's like the letters started to swirl right in front of my eyes. And then it changed to read what the correct date was, which was February 27th. And, February and March do not look at all like each other in print. And then it was like, oh my goodness, what was that all about? And now I think it was like a premonition or a forewarning or getting me prepared, because guess what? I ended up having another near-death experience a little bit after this. As we were finally approaching Toronto International Airport and coming down the plane slowing down and going down, 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 and we're being buffeted all the time with this turbulence. I'm thinking, oh, I'll be so happy when I can see the ground, because all this thoughts of the plane crash and the horrible storm that we're in. And when finally we broke through the clouds, and we could already see the runway lights ahead of us. We were pretty close to the ground. All of a sudden, the pilot of the plane slammed the flaps of the wings in the opposite direction, and the engines were now screaming. He was clearly trying to abort the landing at the last minute. And the plane started shaking violently from this, between the storm and the engines, and trying to start going up again. And people in the plane, they were like, oh my God, they were crying, and people were screaming. I mean, it was really clear. It looked like we were going to crash. And I remember that when that happened, it was like I had an aha experience. I said, oh, I get it. I was meant to survive that plane crash in 1979 so that I'd do my research, I'd write my book on NDEs and spiritually transformative experiences, which had come out the year before in 1994. And now today is the day that I'm going to die in a plane crash. And I had learned in my spiritual studies over these 16 years since my plane crash NDE, that if you are going to die, the best way to die is consciously try to go into that light, and don't stop anywhere in between. Just go like a bee to that light. And so I decided to consciously die. And so I immediately went into prayer and meditation. My only attachment on earth was my young son. And so I prayed for the good Lord to look after my son. And then I consciously went into death. And I was trying to get back into that white light realm where I had been in my earlier near-death experience. And what happened was instantly I found myself out of body. And I was being pulled by this force greater than myself, rapidly up through this dark expanse of space. Maybe people call it a tunnel. For me, it felt like a dark expanse of space. And the difference was, in my 1979 near-death experience, I didn't know what was going on. I was sort of a passive observer when this was happening. This time, I was working with it. I wanted to go where I was being carried. I was like pushing myself. Yes, I'm swimming with the current. I want to get up there. I want to go there. And then what happened was, suddenly I had a life review. And the life review that I experienced was, it was like a stone skipping over the surface of the water. It was like I was jumping through time, and I was being put back to experiences I'd had earlier in my life, as if I'd time traveled, as if I was there again, very briefly experiencing it again. So the first place I time traveled to was my 1979 plane crash near-death experience when I was in the white light. So suddenly, it was like I was there again. I knew it was 1979. It wasn't now. I was re-experiencing everything I was feeling, the bliss, the love, the joy, watching my body trying to swim to shore. And then whoop, suddenly I was taken out of that time, and I was jumped forward in time to 1990. And 1990 to an powerful mystical experience. I call it in my book, my calling mystical experience, where I felt called by spirit to come out of the closet and start advocating for experiencers. That powerful mystical experience. Suddenly I was back in it. I was in the peak of that mystical experience, and feeling every sensation. It was literally that I was there again, having that profound experience. And I was jumped out of that experience, jumped through time, and I was taken to another really powerful spiritual experience I had in 1994, when I was in a time of intense grief, and I had been praying to the Lord for help and for comfort. And I had a profound and intense, very healing spiritual experience in my meditation. Suddenly I'm back in that experience, feeling it, seeing it, as if I traveled in time. And then boop, I was popped out of that, and then I'm back in the tunnel again, and sort of a passage, whatever we're going to call it. And I'm racing upwards towards the light. And this time the surroundings had changed in color, that it wasn't that deep sort of blackish gray, it had now turned to a deep royal blue, a little bit like the color that's behind you there, Peggy. And then all of a sudden, my passage upwards was blocked by a being of light. And that being of light was also that same beautiful, deep sort of royal blue, and was luminescent and was sparkly. And this being of light had a most unusual form. I've never seen anything like it before or afterwards, but this being of light seemed to be half male and half female. And it was as if the right half was male and the left half was female. And it had 4 arms that were held in sort of distinct postures, and one leg was held upwards like dancing. And the closest I've ever seen, there are statues called the dancing Shiva that they have in yoga and in Buddhism, a little bit like that posture, but it didn't look like those statues. It looked different. But and this being that had this just sort of peaceful, loving aura, mentally, telepathically communicated to me, it is not your time. And just like that, I'm back in my body in the plane. And I guess my third eye was wide open or something when I came back in my body, because although I could see the plane and we were still in distress and still shaking, and the pilot had not been able to get it to start ascending yet, and people were still upset and crying in the plane, but I could see these hands of light enveloping the plane. And so somehow I knew we were going to be safe. And sure enough, the pilot did manage to finally get enough airspeed to take the plane up again, and then to circle around, and then later on to safely land the plane. Well, I was in a most extraordinary state of consciousness after this near-death experience. I mean, I immediately knew it was a near-death experience. Nobody had to tell me what had just happened to me. But I didn't return to my normal state of consciousness afterwards. It was like I was wide open. I literally felt afterwards like I had no skin, that there was nothing separating me from everyone and everything around me. And when I got home, I slept very, very deeply that night. And when I woke up the next morning, I found myself in a state of mystical communion. I was home. I felt like the separation that all of us normally feel between ourselves and the divine was completely removed. And I felt like I was completely connected. I literally felt like I was one of a billion legs on a millipede, because we're all connected to the divine. We all are. We're all part of the divine. And that, but the difference was that that veil that blocks our awareness, our realization, our feeling and living and knowing that we are in oneness, connection with the divine, was removed. And I was living in that state of oneness. And it was profound, and it was beautiful. And I remained in that state for about 2 months. And then finally, it contracted, and I was not able to go back into that state through my prayer and meditation. And I've been striving to get back into that beautiful, exquisite state of communion ever since. And it taught me many things, too much that I've time to share today. But I think some of the key points are what I mentioned about how we are all connected to the divine, and that we are all equally loved. And it's only our realization, our direct experience of that communion, of that oneness, of that love, that varies from person to person. And I could also see the reality of reincarnation when I was in that state of consciousness. And it just was obvious to me. Actually, I had access to my past lives. When I would look at people, if I looked in their eyes, I would start seeing their past lives. And I could understand, I could see how there was like a continuation. It's like every incarnation, it's like progressing in the school of lives over many lives, that we're learning. You're in grade 1, then you're in grade 2, you're in grade 3, and that we come back to learn our spiritual lessons and learn. And if we don't manage to pass math in grade 2, well, okay, you can move on to grade 3 in some of your subjects, but you have to redo grade 2 math. And so God gives us those experiences to learn. So it was really wonderful. And anyway, just because of time, I'm going to stop with that. There's much I could say. I just want to also say that it's a profoundly humbling experience. I mean, some people might think it's grandiose that I even share it, but I am sharing it now. I'm a senior. Spirit has guided me to pass on what I've learned, what I've experienced, so that if others have these experiences, they know they're not alone, that these have happened to other people. And you don't have to be some great saint or mystic to have these experiences. Sometimes they happen to normal people like you and me. So anyway, my 5th experience, near-death experience, very briefly to wrap up, happened in 2003, November the 8th, 2003. I had a serious slip and fall accident where I fell and hit my head on rock pavement in Niagara Falls, Canada, and I instantly died from the traumatic brain injury. And my spirit was whisked out of my body by a force greater than myself. And I found myself rapidly brought into that wonderful realm of light that I had been in my plane crash NDE. And this time I was welcomed into the realm of light by 2 beings of light, 2 saints that I recognized from my particular spiritual path, Paramahansa Yogananda and Mahavatar Babaji. And they telepathically explained to me that I had died, my body had died, that my life in the work of Dr. Yvonne Kason was finished. And it felt like there was being like a celebration party or a graduation party or sort of like a birthday party held in my honor when I was arriving in the light, and I was the guest of honor. And the love was incredibly powerful, incredibly beautiful in the light. And I remember that as I was entering the white light realm, my little ego part raised its little head over my shoulder, with a doubt, is like, uh-oh, here comes the life review. Because I'd heard with my research and from all the NDE stories that people get a life review when they, totally die. And, I try to be a good person, but I've made mistakes in my life. So I wasn't really looking forward to reviewing the good, bad, and the ugly of what I'd done in my life. And it was interesting because it was like the 2 saints could read my thoughts. They could read my thoughts because one of them just glanced over at me when I had that thought about, uh-oh, here comes the life review. And just like blew that off, like he would blow a fleck of dust off the shoulder with an understanding of complete love, just complete love, and understanding that the divine higher power, Mother, Father, God, however we understand our higher power, God, loves us so completely that like the loving mother who understands if a child's learning to walk, it's going to make mistakes when you're learning. You're going to trip, you're going to fall, you're going to skin your knees, you're going to bump your heads. And the loving mother gets it, and comforts the child and, try harder next time. It's okay. And rather than punishes the child for these mistakes. And so I could let go of my concern about being judged and just enjoy the love and light and bliss in the light. And then I went into a state of consciousness where I stopped seeing visual images, and it seemed like my consciousness was capable of absorbing vast amounts of information all at once, like, massive downloads. And suddenly I remembered all of my past lives. And it was like, oh, how could I have forgotten? Yes, of course, I remember. And I could see how they all fit together. And I mean, I'd mentioned to you that at various times I'd had insights to some of my past lives, but now it was like I'd had puzzle pieces before, but the whole picture was missing. But now all the pieces were put together and the puzzle was a big whole. And all of a sudden my life as Dr. Yvonne Kason made sense. And it was like an aha experience, because I'd always thought my life was a bit unusual. that I'd had so many near-death experiences and Kundalini awakening and past life recall and all mystical experiences, all sorts of spiritually transformative experiences, when I'm just like this little doctor working in Toronto. Why was all this stuff happening to me? But when I saw my past lives, I realized that, well, hello, this is not my first incarnation being this way, that my soul has had many incarnations where, guess what? I've had past lives where I had near-death experiences. I had past lives where I had a Kundalini awakening. I had past lives where I had mystical experiences. So it was, from a soul level, it made absolute sense that even though, you know, on the worldly level, I wondered what on earth was going on. But from a soul level, this was just my soul being what it was like and what it's been like for many incarnations. Anyway, after a period of timeless time, there's much more that I can say, but I'm just going to cut to the highlights now. Is after a period of timeless time, the two beings of light reappeared to me and said telepathically to me, you may now choose whether to return to the maimed body and or to incarnate in the body of the babe to further serve the divine. And in that completely open-hearted state of complete love, complete trust, complete surrender, I absolutely trusted and surrendered to divine will for me. And my heart instantly responded, Masters, please guide me. What is the higher choice? I want to do God's will. And then they telepathically responded to me in such a loving, sweet manner. It'll be more difficult, but to return to the injured body. And instantly my heart and soul responded, I accept. And it was so fast. It was between the thought I and the thought accept that with a gasp of air, I found myself waking up in my dead body lying on the ground. And it felt like waking up in an ice cube because it was outdoors in winter and my body temperature had dropped. And for the first few minutes, I could see both realms. I could see the white light realm and I could see the world around me. And it was like they were superimposed on each other. And then slowly the white light realm started fading from view until it just became a little spot. And then I was back. I was back, but I was injured. I had a very serious traumatic brain injury. And I went to neuro rehab, the best neuro rehab available. For 7 years, I went to various neuro rehab to try and get better. But slowly I had to accept that for whatever reason in the divine plan, I was not going to be healed. And that now how I could serve others was not out in the world, but is privately in my spiritual life through my prayers and meditation. So I made my prayer and meditation life a real, my spiritual priority, that was now how I would help others through my prayers and meditation. But just when you think you figure out God's plan for your life, God has a surprise in store because suddenly on February 24th, 2016, we're almost at the anniversary, we're very close to it, I experienced a miracle. While I was praying and meditating in Encinitas, California at the Self-Realization Fellowship Retreat, in a spot that I consider and many consider a holy spot where Paramahansa Yogananda used to go into samadhi and commune with God. So the spiritual vibration there is very, very strong and powerful. I was meditating there, and all of a sudden, inwardly, I experienced this eruption of light in the center of my brain. It was like a volcano or a fountain of liquid light erupting in the center of my brain. And it was like the lights came on as if this part of my brain had been in darkness for over 12 years now since my brain injury. And now the lights came on. And the subjective feeling was waking up. It was like I woke up, that my brain woke up. And I was healed. My brain was healed. I experienced a miracle. And all these years, I'd been sort of locked in. It's sort of like a computer where the hard drive works, but the keyboard and the screen doesn't work. That was me. My hard drive was intact, but now the keyboard and screen were working again. And it was like the floodgates open, and all these ideas that had been locked inside of me for these past 12 years, things that I wanted to write in my books, were pouring out of me. And I heard the strong inner guidance repeatedly, actually, pass on what you have learned. So I now call myself sometimes affectionately Yvonne version 2.0. You know, I was offline for refurbishment for 12 years, and version 2.0, the good Lord sent me back to pass on what I have learned. And so it is my great joy to share with you today my experiences. This is part of me passing on what I have learned. And I immediately wrote 2 books, Touched by the Light, which was the first book I wrote. I happen to have it here, which was the first book I wrote after my healing miracle. And now the second book I wrote, it just came out, Soul Lessons from the Light, just came out in December. And this is my story. Now that I'm a retired doctor, I don't have to worry about my license being taken away. I feel free to share my story. And this is the story of my spiritual awakening, of all 5 of my near-death experiences, about my miracle healing. And, you know, I want to pass on the bottom line of the lessons that I learned. And then we can maybe wrap up with that. Is I think what I've learned from all of these experiences I've had in my life is that, number one, we're much more than the physical body. We are spiritual beings, and the physical body is like the car that we're driving around in. And that when our car gets too dented and damaged, our spirit leaves the body, and that we will continue to live on, first on the other side. And then what I was shown is that we then reincarnate in a new car, in a new body, to continue to grow and learn. So we're truly spiritual beings. And that what it's all about, what life is all about, is about learning and growing spiritually. And whatever spiritual lessons we don't learn this time around, well, good Lord, divine plan, we'll be given opportunities to learn those lessons later, so may as well learn them now. But you know, and obviously the higher power is very real, whether we believe in it or not. It is real and loves us all unconditionally, and is rooting for all of us to find our way home. You know, that ultimately it's going to be a good, happy ending for everybody, that may take longer for some than for others, but we're all eventually loved and going to find our way home. That's what I have learned. And then the final thing I want to share is that never give up hope, because miracles do happen. You never know when the divine might intervene and a miracle may happen, because I'm a living testimonial. Anyone can have a miracle in their life. So never give up hope.
Is that a real fear, like by writing these kind of books, that someone's medical license could be taken away?
I had to be cautious during the years that I was still practicing as a medical doctor. And there were times that I was challenged by governing licensing bodies and malpractice insurance, et cetera. And so I was always guarded about sharing my personal experiences. I shared a little bit, but there were some I didn't feel safe enough to share until now. And now that I'm retired, it's like, okay, folks, it's in my book. I've written about it.
So if you're a doctor, like, you have to really watch what you say about your personal feelings, or
I think as a doctor, you have to be, when you're in clinical practice, you have to fit within the parameters and guidelines of the medical profession. And you have to be very non-aligned, and you can't be promoting your own particular views, whether it be political views or spiritual views, right? That you have to keep that out of the practice of medicine, so that, and to treat everybody with equal respect, whether they have any agreement or disagreement with your particular views. That's part of what you have to do to be able to treat everybody. And so I was very careful in everything that I wrote, to be very open, that people who had different opinions, to have space for them, to have room for them. Whereas now this book, these are my opinions. Okay, these are my experiences and these are my opinions. You may like them, you may not like them, you may agree, you may disagree, but this is what I've learned and these are my opinions after having had spiritually transformative experiences my whole life.
And it seems like the doctors that told you these experiences were hallucinations was personal opinions and not based on anything they would have learned in medical school, I'm assuming.
Well, I think it was what was taught in medical school, because there really was nothing in medicine to encompass spiritual experiences, or in psychology, or in psychiatry until the 1990s. You know, there's now a diagnostic category, a spiritual or religious problem. So it even exists that is around, but it was in medicine, it was sort of considered this was not a topic doctors were supposed to talk about, like clergy could talk about it or the social worker could talk about it. But my experience was doctors needed to be able to talk about it because patients wanted to be able to talk to a doctor about their experiences. And when I specialized my practice in 1990 in counseling patients with diverse spiritual experiences, including near-death experiences, my practice was flooded. People really wanted to talk to a doctor about it and have a doctor say, yes, I believe you. You're not crazy. This is a type of spiritually transformative experience. And there's a name for it. And I would help them find a name, whether it be a near-death experience or a Kundalini awakening or an after-death communication or a past life recall, whatever the name, I would help them find a name, or a mystical experience. And in fact, I found that many people are having mystical experiences that they may even seem NDE-like, but if you're not near death, it's not a near-death experience, it's a mystical experience, and it can have the same transformative impact that a near-death experience has.
I wish in a perfect world that they could recognize, maybe during triage, if someone says, I was just out of my body on the way here in the squad, or, I've been having these reoccurring dreams that don't seem like dreams. I'm seeing my grandma who's passed, or, that somehow that the nurses could get on board and see these things as a possible impending death sign here, because I think they're really missing the mark. They're really missing an opportunity. If they're all going to think, oh, I heard about this and it's hallucinations.
Yeah.
You're going to miss that.
It's slowly improving. I mean, and there were other doctors and psychologists out there who've been trying to get the word out more and more into all of the healthcare professions about the whole spectrum of spiritually transformative experiences. And you mentioned another one there, the end of life experiences, which are very sacred and very special. And it's increasing. So it's increasing, but, I guess some of us are a little impatient. We wish it would move a bit faster.
Yeah. I keep saying, in 1986, when I'm 25 years old in a wheelchair and just got to the emergency room and I pass out, when I come to and I realize I had just died, I was in heaven, and I was just accepting it. And now I'm back. And how am I going to get my doctor to believe I'm about dead here? Because the pain has stopped, the nausea has stopped. I physically feel fine. But because of the experience, I know 100% I was just dead. It's not fixed. But even though I'm feeling fine, like God sent me back for a short window of time, see if the doctor will fix you, and if I can't make him believe, and I couldn't get out the words, I couldn't say that. I just died. And so he examined me, says, you're just fine. It's not a tubal pregnancy. Why do you keep saying that? And I said, well, I'm not going home, because I knew if I did, I would die and my little boys would find me.
Wow. And
And so I just said, I'm not going home. And he looked at my husband like, what's wrong with her? And he said, well, it'll make you feel better since you live an hour away. You can spend the night. But, he walked away shaking his head. Well, he come in the next morning and did an ultrasound. I had internal bleeding, filled my entire abdominal cavity. And so, I just wish
So your
that
life was saved by your near-death
it
experience
was.
and by you refusing to go home. That's an incredible story, Peggy.
And I had died again during the night because I kept passing out again and again, never have another NDE. But after so many times during the night, I realized I was dying each time. And I said to God, God, I know you can't keep bringing me back. Can you just keep me alive till morning? Maybe my doctor will come in early and do another ultrasound. If it's not tubal, then what is it? Because I knew I was on borrowed time here.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what happened. He came in early and they found it. And they said it was the biggest tubal pregnancy the hospital ever saw, all this.
Wow.
But, I think today in 2023, if some 25-year-old girl come in with tubal pregnancy and then there was no evidence of it like mine, because I was pregnant for twins. One was in the uterus, the other was in the tube, half in and half out. That's why the earlier ultrasound he had done in his office had showed both babies were in the uterus. That's why he refused to believe it was tubal. And so, could a person today, is my question I have in my head, be better off than I was in 1986 if they spoke
Yes.
those words and said,
Yes.
I
I
just
think,
died, I was in heaven?
yeah,
Would they be taken to the psych ward? Would they have somebody roll their eyes, or would they say, we need to do
it,
another ultrasound?
it could be any of the above, and it really depends a lot on the doctor
Yeah.
because they haven't yet, I'm using the word yet, put in all medical schools or all nursing schools across the United States training programs to teach people about near-death experiences and other spiritually transformative experiences. But some are, and I've spoken to numbers of medical audiences, whether it be doctors, nurses, allied health professionals, about NDEs and other STEs. And I've been doing that since 1990. And so, I mean, that those doctors and nurses are out there. And I'm not the only one who's doing that. Dr. Bruce Grayson from IANDS and others, and even what you're doing with your podcast, Peggy, and the other people who are spreading awareness, or what we're doing with Spiritual Awakenings International, spreading awareness. I mean, it's all having a ripple effect. And so I think it's actually getting more. I mean, I'm just going to tell you, I was engaged a few years back to a fellow. He had to have a very serious heart surgery. He unfortunately died a little while after the surgery, before we were married. But anyway, but when we were in the cardiac intensive care unit, the nurse looking after him said, oh, what do you do? And I said, oh, I'm a retired medical doctor who specializes in near-death experiences and other spiritually transformative experiences. So this is the nurse in the ICU. She looks around. Is anybody listening? I have to tell you something. so
I've run into that too, not being a retired doctor, but just talking to nurses. So I'm in with somebody else.
And so she comes and she tells me, I've heard the stories I've heard here in the intensive care unit. And so she tells me about several people who've had, died and then be resuscitated, and have told her as a nurse, because they were afraid to tell the doctor, but they told her as a nurse about their near-death experiences. So it's happening, Peggy. I told her about my book. She at least knew that they were near-death experiences, because she'd actually, I don't remember where she'd heard about near-death experiences, maybe on TV or on YouTube or something like that. Everything's helping. I think everything, you can be proud of what you're doing, and I'm proud of what we're doing with Spiritual Awakenings International, because everything's like a helping, and we're all helping each other to raise awareness of this, and not just in the USA, but around the world too.
Yeah, I just wish people would realize that this isn't just entertainment. This isn't just we're selling a book, because I am too. This isn't just this and that. This, like, we could actually save lives here if people would get it and realize, okay, you listen to NDEs, great. But what if grandma says, I had a dream last night, I was with my husband who died years ago? That would they get it? Oh, maybe grandma needs to go to the doctor.
Well, that's why
maybe we need to check her blood pressure and vitals.
That's why with Spiritual Awakenings International, we're focusing on all types of spiritually transformative experiences, because NDEs are just one type. And that's exactly what you're saying, is that, grandma seeing a grandpa in her dream, and maybe that means she's going to pass soon. That actually happened with my aunt. She felt comfortable enough to tell me that, her deceased husband came to her in a dream. And I instantly got it. I knew that it meant that it was going to be her time soon. And it really felt so wonderful to be able to talk to her about it, and say, well, what do you think this means, Auntie? And she says, well, I think it's my time to go. And she was okay with that. And she says, I've had a good life. I mean, she was like 96 or something, right? I've had a good life. I'm looking forward to seeing hubby again. And I felt really blessed that I was able to support her and that she felt safe enough to speak with me. So I think your show is helping to do that, and other people's efforts too, to raise awareness about all the different kinds of spiritually transformative experiences. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Like when we hear those things, I think we should think like, check, please, like somebody's about to check out. We need to do something here. Like, even, people that, like my mother-in-law a few years ago, she was sent home and told to go home and die. We didn't know she was going to go so fast. Like by the end of the week, she was gone. We thought it'd be a few months. And so she was sent home with hospice. And when I walked in, my sister-in-law said, Mom just said, Grandma, which is already passed, told Mom, Janice, don't get in a hurry. And I knew right then, we're getting down to the wire here. Like, check, please. And so I acted accordingly. We got down to business and holding her hand and walking her home because I knew that. But a lot of people would think,
good for you.
She had a dream. And
not you.
If nobody gets anything else out of this, they can roll their eyes and say, well, I don't believe in reincarnation, or I don't believe in God. I don't believe in her. I don't like that. Well, fine, good. But just realize, pay attention to the signs of dying, because we get those, like you left before the accident even happened twice. And the body can just go before there's an actual event, and I think it's not much different, say rape or child abuse. They just leave the body and they're gone. And people think, oh, that is, like the mind's way of coping or disassociation. I'm like, no, you know what it is God rescuing us. We don't have to feel the impact of that car accident, of that train going to hit you, or that plane crash.
That's right.
It's God's mercy. It's going to pull you out of there. It's like, you're not going to feel that. You're not going to experience it, because, that's what happened to me when I was 16 and I was kidnapped and the guys about ready to rape me. And I was praying to God, I wish I wasn't on this earth. And all of a sudden I wasn't. I was up in the night sky among the stars, looking down at earth, had my long brown hair, my skinny, tiny little body, my clothes on, and I was rescued. And people hear that, that work with child abuse victims, and they think, oh, that's just like a trick your mind played. I'm like, no, I was there.
Yeah, that's not a trick your mind
out
played.
there. I experienced none of that was happening on earth.
I think that's the same as the doctor saying I hallucinated with my near death. They don't know any better. So I think that we have to have compassion and realize they don't know any better. And part of what the mission that Spirit has given us by that we're surviving all these experiences is that we're part of the education team. Helping to raise awareness that all of this is real. And I mean, what really touches me about what you said is just how much God loves us, that we are protected in these situations. And it's actually incredibly comforting to know that, isn't it?
And I think some of the medical community that don't believe in God don't want to believe in these experiences, because it kind of points to this is God here. So, and they don't want to X and Y equal this, they want it to equal something else. So
it's like one of
hallucinations.
One of my conclusions in my book is that God is real, whether you believe in it or not.
Yeah, you don't need your permission.
That's just the way it is. It's not like the sun rises, whether you can see it or not. It's just what happens on planet Earth.
Yeah, that's the way it is. Well, they'll all find out soon enough.
Yeah, they will. They will. Well, Pegi,
thank you.
It's absolutely wonderful being on your show, and it's absolutely wonderful meeting you. And I hope our paths cross again.
Now, you want to say the name again of your organization?
Okay, well, I'll say two things. Is my book, which I would love people to get and read my stories, Soul Lessons from the Light. And you can get that on ebook or paperback and your favorite book outlet or Amazon, whatever you like. And the organization that I am the president and founder of is Spiritual Awakenings International. The website is spiritualawakeningsinternational.org. And we have got experiencer sharing circles the first Saturday of every month. And we've got speaker events the third Saturday of every month. Speakers speaking on all sorts of spiritually transformative experiences. And we also have Spanish events, Spanish language events, the second Saturday of the month. So, and everything is free. We're on a donation basis because we know that often people who are going through intense spiritual awakenings might be having financial challenges, and we don't want money to be a reason that people are not attending our events. And then we have a great conference coming up in June. So June 10th and 11th. So invite anyone to come to.
Will that be all online, or is that a physical?
It's going to be online this year. We're hoping to have physical next year, but this year we're still going to do it as an online conference. Yeah.
Now, is your organization all online, or do you have a physical place?
No, we were born during COVID. We're a COVID baby. So currently we are all online, and we're hoping to make the transition to being in person and online in the future. But we are an international, we're a US-based 501c3 nonprofit charity. We're considered an educational charity. But we have subscribers from 77 countries around the world. And we have people usually from at least 9 countries showing up at our events, which is so wonderful. So we really are, and being online, of course, you can join from anywhere around the world. Set your alarm clock for 2 in the morning and then join our events. And then we also have our videos of all our past events on our website and our Spiritual Awakenings International YouTube channel. So if you miss the event, usually a few weeks afterwards, we'll have the video posted on our YouTube channel.
Now, you were president of IANDS, and you and the
Yes,
vice president of IANDS went together and started this. Is that right,
That's
Robert
right.
Baer?
Yeah, that's right. We both had a very strong download, you know what the term means, like from spirit, guidance from spirit, that we were to found a new organization that would have a much broader focus than IANDS, because as you know, IANDS focuses primarily the near-death experience. But my interest has always been the whole range of spiritual experiences people are having. And that's why I coined that phrase, spiritually transformative experiences, as an umbrella term for all the types of spiritual experiences people are having. And so Spirit was guiding me that we were to found a new organization, and we were to call it Spiritual Awakenings International, and that we would focus on the whole range of spiritual experiences. We're by experiencers. Robert and I are both experiencers. Our entire board and advisory board, we're all experiencers. So we're by experiencers for experiencers, you know, raising awareness, networking, sharing of experiences, and we're very international.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you, Peggy.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.